guys, I'm here today to very briefly talk about the books I've DNF'd in the months of February and March. I'm trying this year to make sure that every month I talk about the books I DNF, and that's because I DNF a lot of books, but usually I DNF them when I'm quite a way through them. And I realised that, especially last year, I had a lot of people comment on my videos being like, oh, did you ever get around to reading that book that you showed in a haul or a TBR? And I was thinking, well actually, yeah, I did, and I tried it and I really didn't like it. And then I've never really mentioned it. So this year I decided to try and talk about my DNFs, one as a way of recognising that there are other things I'm reading that don't work for me, and two as a way of not just letting some of these books completely disappear off my shelves and acknowledging to you guys what happened to them. And I have not had many DNFs in March, so I thought because I hadn't done my February DNFs I would combine them into two. I'm aware that, like, with everything that's going on right now, perhaps negativity isn't the right outset, but what I will say is I didn't want to like miss out months from this because it just seemed like a weird thing to do. And also, none of these books I really disliked. They were actually all books I could have carried on and finished, but I'm just very much of the mindset now, and I hope this is a positive spin on things to say to you guys, of all the books out there in the world, the ones on your shelves, the one on your library hold list, the ones you've not even thought about yet, for me, I don't see the point in reading books that I'm only going to give a 2, maybe a 3 star. It just doesn't seem worth it to me. So I've got to the point now where as soon as I start feeling about a book that I don't want to reach for it, and that book is stopping me from wanting to read, I evaluate whether that's because I'm in an odd mood or whether it's because of the book. And if it's because of the book, I just give up on it, and that's absolutely fine. And I felt so much better about it. And actually, this video now, every single book I'm going to mention here, 2 years ago I would have persevered with every single one of them, and the best star rating they would have got is 3 stars. And what would have been the point? So I'm going to just mention them briefly, and then, you know, the next video will be books I've really enjoyed again. So I DNF'd 4 books in the month of February. So the first one is Hart Spring Mountain by McArthur. So I actually started reading this, I think, in early December. I got about halfway through, and I picked this up because I read and loved her short story collection Half Wild, and so I wanted to read her debut novel. This is set, let me just check, in rural Vermont, yes, and it's set in 2011 after Tropical Storm Irene has wreaked havoc, and our main character travels from New Orleans to her home to find out where her mother has disappeared to. Her mother, who is a drug addict, has disappeared during the storm, and you know there's fears for her life, and so she goes back to try and find her mother. And this becomes a blend of lots of different voices from this family throughout history over the last sort of 100 years, and they're predominantly female voices. And this family has always lived on the outskirts of society. They live in houses that are very rural, or perhaps even trailers on land nearby, and they're very lonely people, very connected to nature. And I enjoyed this. This is nicely written. What I found is that I like books with no plot, but there was zero plot, and there was just nothing to pull me through. I didn't feel particularly connected to any of the characters. There was no really narrative. You know, you're told the narrative is her looking for her mother. She's there for weeks and it doesn't feel like she's really looking that hard. And it just got to the point where I could have carried on, and perhaps it would have had something happen towards the end, but I just lost interest, and I felt sad because I really liked her short story collection. But I don't want to be bound to reading an author's book just because I've enjoyed one of them, because it doesn't necessarily mean all the others are going to be great. So I decided to DNF that one. I also decided to DNF Deeplight by Hardinge, and this will be the last book I attempt to read by this author. I read The Lie Tree by Hardinge when it came out a few years ago, and I thought it was absolutely fine. I think I gave it 3 stars. I was expecting to love it, and I think in part my reasons for expecting to love her books are because of the cover design. There's something to be said for people who get amazing cover designers on board. You know, that's the publishers who do that, not necessarily the authors themselves. But I think, you know, she's been out for a lot of years, and when her book seemed to have really picked up is when The Lie Tree came out, and there was that phenomenal cover. I'm not saying it's all down to the cover. Obviously that book in itself pulled a lot of people in, but I think it's definitely made a difference, and it's definitely made me as a reader want to love her books. The premise of this is that it's set in some sort of fantastical world where there was these deep sea gods, these sort of mystical creatures, and for whatever reason years ago they all died. and people go down, deep sea dive and collect bits of their remains, and these items are sort of revered and they have magical abilities. And we followed these two young boys who have this sort of toxic friendship and some mysteries they get involved in to do with deep sea diving for these god parts. And I got about 120 pages in, I think, and I just found the friendship a bit annoying. I wasn't particularly engaged with either of the boys, and I found their conflict and their dynamic frustrating. I thought the notion of the world was good, but there didn't seem to be enough development for me, and yeah, just I'm not a massive fan of her writing style really, and I just didn't really feel drawn to it. So again, one I could have carried on with, but just didn't interest me enough to do that, so I DNF'd it. Another one is How It Was by Janet Ellis. So I read The Butcher's Hook by Janet Ellis, which I know lots of us read and really enjoyed. And so I was intrigued by this one, and I actually really like the sound of this one. This is set in the 1970s predominantly. It starts in present day when a woman is sitting beside her husband's bedside in hospital and he's dying, and she starts to reminisce back to the 70s when something rather drastic happened to their family, and you get the feeling that she no longer talks to her daughter and that perhaps her son is no longer around. When you go back to the 1970s, you realise that she's starting to read her teenage daughter's diary, and actually it's really odd because she really dislikes her daughter. She says things like, one of the things that really struck me is that when she changes her daughter's bed linen, she feels the warmth of her daughter's body still on the sheets, and it disgusts her. So I think she's very good at that visceral sort of, how do I make, like, it makes you feel uncomfortable. She's very good at showing the dark parts of people that you wouldn't expect to be revealed, particularly, you know, this mother-daughter relationship, which should be loving and caring and just isn't. But what I found is there starts to be this narrative of this man being involved, and he's obviously interested in the daughter, but the mother is interested in him, and it just felt a little bit cliche and stereotypical, and I could see where it was going to go, and I could see that this mother character was just going to keep making the same mistakes, and it was going to be really frustrating, and I just wasn't that interested. So I think her writing style is great, but I think that the premise of this, for quite a long book, I mean this is around 400 pages I think, I just didn't feel like I could be on board with it for that long, so I gave up on that one as well. The next one is a library copy, so I've since taken it back, but it's I Am China by Xiaolu. So I made a video on my Patreon about the 12 memoirs I wanted to try and read this year, and this was the first one I picked up, so it was really a shame that I decided to DNF this. I got about 150 pages in, so I got quite a big way through, and this is the one I really struggled the most to DNF. I rarely DNF non-fiction, especially memoir, and I felt quite bad DNFing this. So the conceit of this memoir is that Xiaolu grew up in a remote, impoverished Chinese village with her grandparents. Her parents had left her to be raised by her grandparents, and when she was around 7 they came and collected her and took her to live with them and her brother in a communist compound, and you then follow her as she goes to university and then later on moves to the UK. I got up to the part when she's then about to go to university, and what I found for me is that her life is really interesting, very sad. Her landscape writing is really good. I could picture all the buildings and landscapes she described. She gave you nuanced descriptions of the people in her life, particularly I felt her grandmother, but her writing style is very matter of fact. Other than describing the landscape, she doesn't really, it's not lyrical or descriptive, which are things I really like in my writing. And the point at which I DNF'd made sense to me because I'd really been conflicted with this one because I didn't want to DNF a memoir that dealt with such difficult topics that I was interested in, but then I felt like I wasn't really enjoying it. And then there's a section where she talks about a poet she came across and how much she admired his work and how she wanted to try and emulate that in her own work, and you can tell she's very much succeeded. And when she describes this poet's work, she writes one of the poems that she loved, and I hated the poem. I mean, the poem was literally like, you know, really stark and matter of fact and just no descriptions to it. And she said that's how she wanted her writing to be. She wanted to strip her writing of all emotion and description, and that's what she's done, and that just didn't work for me. This memoir has a really high rating on Goodreads. I think it's entirely down to the type of reader I am. It's nothing against the memoir. I like lyrical, beautiful writing style. I like people who, you know, on the page discuss how this moment made them feel and what they learned about themselves, and she's not really doing that. She's like, this is what happened, this, next thing. And I'm sure that'll work for a lot of people, but it just didn't work for me. And then I only DNF'd 2 books in March, which is really good for me, and both of those were from the Women's Prize long list. The first one was Weather by Janet Ellis. I wasn't sure if I'd like this one, and I wouldn't have picked this up myself, but I was kindly sent it by the publisher, so I thought may as well give it a go, and it's quite a short book. Got about a third of the way through this, which I think is around 60 pages, and again, I could so easily have carried on because it was really short, but I sat there and thought, this is probably going to take me another hour and a half to read, and in that hour and a half I could do something I really enjoy. I could read another book that I may really enjoy, and this just isn't going to be that. And again, with the Weather, as with I Am China, this has nothing to do with the book itself, with there being anything bad about it. It's to do with who I am as a reader. The way this author writes is very matter of fact, it's very intellectual, it's a bit philosophical, and I don't like any of those things in my fiction. The protagonist is this sort of middle class, quite privileged woman who's moving through her life, working at a library, and she starts to be an assistant for somebody where she answers emails about this climate change podcast, and it's all these tiny vignettes about her thoughts, and it really darts around, and I just didn't like it. There's no narrative. Yeah, it felt really privileged, really intellectual, and just lacking in any type of beautiful writing, and that's just all the things I dislike in a book, so I very quickly DNF'd that one. And then lastly we have Queenie by Candice Carty Williams. This is again on the Women's Prize long list, and I got around 80 pages into this, which is probably about a quarter of the way through, and again I could have carried on and finished this one, but I just didn't care to. So lots of people are really enjoying this book, and when I was considering DNFing this book, what I decided to do is go and look for reviews from people who weren't necessarily enjoying it, and I also tried to find reviews from own voices reviewers. So I tried to find reviews from women of colour who were a similar age to Queenie, and some of those women also happened to be from Jamaican heritage. So I felt that was necessary because actually an awful lot of the reviews I'd seen on BookTube were from white readers, and I didn't necessarily think that someone who wasn't an own voices reader would pick up on some of the nuances of Queenie's story. And so the issues I had with Queenie, firstly, is that I just don't think it's very well written, and the dialogue felt really stilted to me. There's one bit when Queenie's having a conversation and she references, she says the United Kingdom instead of the UK. It just would never happen, absolutely never happen. Nobody in the UK says the United Kingdom to someone who's also from the UK. They just don't. So things like that just really, I found really jarring. Right at the start of the novel there's some dialogue with her boyfriend. The dialogue feels really formal and stilted. You know, they're in a relationship, they have been for years. That didn't make sense to me. And I just felt like it was quite surface level. I felt like it was trying to deal with quite serious topics to do with interrace relationships, and, you know, basically Queenie is quite racist herself, and how a person of colour can be racist against themselves and against, you know, particularly Queenie's quite racist against men of colour. And I felt like they're really difficult, weighty topics to handle, and actually they were just being skimmed over the top. And when I watched a lot of reviews from reviewers of colour, they went to town on this book, and you know, obviously there's been people who've enjoyed this book, but a lot of the reviews I watched highlighted issues for me that I hadn't, you know, noticed as much, and when they did comment on them I was like, God, yeah, that's quite bad. So for me this was a poorly written book, but also one that just handled the issues it was trying to handle quite badly, so it just didn't work for me, so DNF that one as well. So those are all the books I DNF'd in the last 2 months. I think 6 books is quite good going for me. I've had times when I DNF that many in a month, so that's not so bad. So yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you DNF'd any of them. I'd love to know your stance on DNFing. Years ago I didn't DNF anything, and a book could be on my TBR, on my currently reading shelf for months. Just free yourself of it, trust me. Like, you will be a much happier reader if you allow yourself to DNF, because I do. And I know, you know, when I say this, a lot of people say things like, you know, I'm really good at choosing what I like, and I get that, but I feel like there's a limit to how good you can be at it, because without reading the first few pages of the book, all you can really know is what it's about. You don't know what the author's writing style is like, what the you know, the character development is like, what the pacing is going to be like. All you know is the premise, and a book is so much more than the premise. So actually I think it's perfectly okay to have a, you know, a 20% or even more unsuccess rate, and I think it's okay to acknowledge that and to just DNF them. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.